It does, but it's not quite specific enough. Only half a mark for lungs. So again, you've got to make sure you're always using that technical terminology to make sure you pick up as many marks as possible. Right, question 15, this is where things start to become a little bit more difficult and involve a little bit more thought and linking different things together. So the first part of the question asks you about the physical effects of stress. Note that the word physical is in bold print. Always pay close attention to the words in bold print. Always read the question properly. So physical effects of stress. Some people talked about mental effects of stress, psychological effects. You wouldn't have picked up marks for those. So here this person has correctly identified 2 physical effects. So technique worsening, this first point here, picked up a mark there for mentioning that. Feeling sick, a physical effect. Okay, another one that could have been mentioned is to do with tightness in the muscles, another physical effect. Okay, then moving down into part B, it says for each of these physical effects, explain how they could affect an athlete's performance. Key word there, performance. So what impact is that going to have on the way they take part, on whether they achieve, whether they win, whether they score, whether they achieve a good time. So this person here has talked about the technique, meaning that they might end up getting injured if they're using a poor technique, which obviously then gives the opposition an advantage. So that's a very good point, talking about injury. The second point they've made, feeling sick, and they've talked about that potentially that person may have to be removed from the competition altogether, which means that they won't be able to carry on taking part. Okay, so clearly there they've talked about how performance is affected. Potential injury and potentially being removed from the competition altogether. Looking at the mark scheme for that question, a couple of things that weren't mentioned in that answer but you could have put: shaking and increased sweating, and as I said before, tightness in the muscles. Okay. Then if we look down at the second part of the question about explaining how this could affect performance, then we need to think about how the athlete might perform poorly. They might use incorrect technique, okay, which could lead to them feeling frustrated, could lead to them feeling aggressive, and they're much more likely to make mistakes, which could then mean that they lose the race, they lose the game, they give possession away. So always trying to relate it back to performance. Question 16 was answered pretty well, but far too many people only achieved 2 marks instead of the full 3. So here is a very good answer that picked up all 3 marks, and this person has clearly identified 3 separate things, 3 separate precautions that could be taken to try and reduce the chance of injury. So firstly they've talked about checking equipment to make sure that it's safe. Secondly, they've talked about warming up. And then finally, they've talked about protective equipment. And they've given an example, which is always good practice. So looking at the mark scheme, there's actually 5 points on there that you could have chosen from. So you only needed to mention 3 of those 5. So the previous answer talked about warming up, talked about risk assessment, didn't use the exact words risk assessment, but it talked about checking equipment, which is the same thing. Unfortunately, some people in your answers, what you did is you talked about checking equipment and then gave a separate point of risk assessment. Actually, what you've done there is you've repeated yourself. You've used the same answer twice, so be careful on that one. And the final thing that it talked about was protective equipment. So we've got 2 other points that could have been made there: following the rules and wearing appropriate clothing or footwear. Question number 17, another 2-part question. These 2-part questions occasionally can be a negative thing, because if you miss a mark on the first part, it quite often means that you're going to miss a mark or 2 on the second part as well. So it's really important that you read these questions carefully and really think about what it is they're asking. A few people slipped up on this question, perhaps not reading that part properly about cardiovascular system. A few people mentioning other short-term effects on different parts of the body, such as sweating or getting red in the face. So we're talking about the cardiovascular system. So there's actually only 3 that you could have had, so you had to get all 3 of those answers. Moving on to part B of the question, you then had to select 2 of those answers. So this question, it's really important that you knew your stuff in part A, because that would allow you to access the marks in part B. So choose 2 and explain why they occur. So we're talking about detail, we're talking about knowledge and understanding. So the key words here to talk about are oxygen, more oxygen to the muscles, more blood to the muscles, more oxygen to the muscles, and the removal of carbon dioxide. So you needed to talk about those gases and why they're needed during exercise. So here we can see a full marks answer for question 17. Part A, this person has correctly identified the 3 things: breathing rate, blood pressure and heart rate. Okay, they've put it in continuous prose. You didn't necessarily have to do that. You could have put 3 bullet points down the side and just listed them. In part B of their answer, you can see that they've clearly talked about oxygen, talked about oxygen being required. They've also gone into a bit more detail with oxygen debt, but that's not necessary. And they've talked about removing carbon dioxide quicker, and they've talked about the heart pumping the blood around the body quicker. A really good answer. Right, question 18, another 2-parter, and this one talking about fatigue. So in general, fatigue is a whole body, mental and physical, just extreme tiredness. But this question's asking you about local muscular fatigue. We've been through this before in lessons. So this one is where we're talking about just one muscle or one group of muscles that is feeling fatigued. This would happen as a result of that muscle or the muscle group contracting over and over again. So for example, if you did 100 sit-ups, your abdominal muscles, that group of muscles, would become tired. Your other muscles, your biceps, triceps, the muscles in your legs, would not be feeling the same level of fatigue. Moving on to the second part of the question, very few people managed to achieve the full 3 marks in this part of the question. So this person here has, and what they've done is they've managed to pick out 3 different reasons why someone might feel that extreme tiredness. And this is not a trick question. There's actually quite a lot of options you could have gone with. This person's picked out the fact that someone's fitness might not be as good. They've talked about cardiovascular endurance. They've then talked about lactic acid building up, which again might happen when you're feeling tired and you've been doing exercise for a long period of time. And then finally, they've just talked about the actual duration or the difficulty of the task being that high that the person is getting so tired. As I said, that question is not a trick question. There's a great big list here of all the things you could have put, so you just had to choose 3 things from this list. So if we look at the previous answer, they were talking about lactic acid building up, they were talking about being unfit, and they were talking about the length of time or how long they were doing that strenuous activity. Okay, so lots of other things you could have picked from that list. Right, so now the next few questions, the final part of the exam, is all about the scenario. And this is something you need to get used to. This is something that is going to happen for your real GCSE exam. You will be given a scenario. In that case, you'll be given it in advance, so you'll have plenty of time to read through it, become familiar with it, and to really get to grips with the different things in that scenario that you might be asked questions about. Okay, so straight away looking at the scenario, we can pick out bits of information that are key that we need to remember. And it's really good practice in an exam to underline or highlight the key things that questions might ask you about. So straight away we can look at the fact that Shireen is 16 years old, and we know that she's female. So gender and age could come into play. We know that she is competing regularly, and we know that she's done different activities. She's done running, and she's done this at quite a high level. She's represented a county, and she's also won the national championships. Okay, we've also can see from this information next that she is a longer distance runner, moving from 800 up to 1,500 and 3,000 metres. We can also see from the second paragraph that she has other interests such as gymnastics, and she's competed in competitions with that as well. But she's looking to improve. So that's something that might be asked in the questions. So question number 19, the first of the scenario questions, a nice easy 2 marks. First part of the question, identify one component of fitness that Shireen will need in order to improve in gymnastics. So you picked up 1 mark straight away for identifying a component of fitness that she would need. A lot of people picked balance, an obvious choice for gymnastics. A lot of the components of fitness could have been used as long as you gave a good reason. So our second example here uses power, which is a fine example, as long as you can back it up with a good reason why. So you're asked in the second part of the question to give an example of why this is important. So you needed to talk about a situation in gymnastics where she would need that component of fitness. So the first answer does that really well. It talks about specific apparatus, it talks about the beam, needing to balance on the beam, because if she falls off, she's going to lose points and reduce her chance of winning a competition. A really good answer, I really like that. The second answer talks about power, an equally good answer. In this case, they're talking about the ability to push off the floor when jumping to do a flip or a somersault or any kind of movement on the floor. So we know that power is to do with combination of strength and speed, and we know that jumping is a good example of a power activity, a powerful movement. So again, another good explanation of why that component of fitness is important. Question 19b, very few people missed out on the mark for this question. Just a 1 mark question, a nice simple one about which type of respiration. So we're looking at aerobic or anaerobic. So straight away we should be looking at that distance there. So the 3,000 metres is a long distance event. Anything long lasting is aerobic. Anything that's short bursts of intense activity, that's when we're looking at anaerobic. So this one, long lasting, aerobic. Question 19c asks you about anxiety. And again, this is another example of the importance of reading every word in the question. Can't emphasise that enough, how important that is. So here, this word performance is a word that not everybody properly read when they were answering this question. So this person has correctly answered the question, and they've talked about how feeling anxious, feeling stress might impact on the physical performance, the way that this person performs in this activity. So we've got a mark for talking about feeling sick and talking about technique, really important here. Okay, we've also talked about the likelihood of injury, which is another impact on performance, which might mean that she has to stop taking part altogether. And then we've got another mark here talking about not being able to run as far. So she might not be able to go as far because her muscles might be tense from being anxious. So a really good answer there that focuses in on this word here, performance, and talks about what impact the anxiety is going to have on the way that she runs in the race. Quite a few people missed out on marks in this question because they focused too much in their answer on the way that Shireen might be feeling, so on why she might be nervous because there's a crowd or because she's performing against people who can perform well, or because she's expected, there's a high expectation that she'll do well. That's all relevant, it's all true, but it's not to do with the way she might perform physically. So make sure you read the question properly. The final 2 questions on the exam paper, both worth 7 marks. So the longest questions involving long answers. As you can see from this section of the mark scheme, they're also marked in a slightly different way. So there's different bands that you can be marked in. And these bands are to do with how much you show that you understand what you're talking about, how well you present your ideas. So your spelling, your punctuation, your grammar does have an impact on how many marks you can get. And also the use here of specialist terms. So that's what I was talking about earlier, making sure you're using the correct terminology. You're not using simple